Chapter 1, The Isle of Whispering Reeds. The exile was not a sudden storm, but a slow, cold receding of the tide. Elara stood on the jagged shoreline of the Isle of Whispering Reeds, her long, honey-blonde hair whipping in the salt spray like a tattered silk banner. She was 10 years old when her father's carriage had rattled away, leaving her with nothing but a small trunk of books and the heavy, suffocating silence of the forest. In the eyes of her kin, Elara was a mistake of nature, a scurry girl. While her sisters grew into tall, graceful beauties, Elara remained small and delicate. Her most jarring features were the ones she couldn't hide, a thin, twitching mouse tail that peeked from beneath her skirts, and eyes that didn't reflect the light but generated it. They were two glowing embers, burning with a soft, orange luminescence that made her look like a creature caught between a hearth fire and a nightmare. "You're a smudge on our lineage," her mother had whispered, refusing to look at the girl's twitching ears. Life on the island was a rhythm of survival. Elara built a hut from driftwood and woven seagrass. She learned which berries were sweet and which brought the sleep of death. She spent her nights watching the mainland across the channel, the distant, flickering lights of a world that had traded her for a bit of social standing. She wasn't angry, she was hollow. She believed the curse was her soul manifesting on the outside, small, timid, and unwanted. Chapter 2, The Castaway and the Catastrophe. Miles away, aboard the merchant vessel the Gilded Crest, a tiny ball of slate-gray fur named Ash was experiencing a crisis. Ash was a kitten of noble pedigree but ignoble courage. Specifically, Ash was terrified of mice. He wasn't just wary, he was paralyzed by them. To Ash, a mouse was not prey, it was a twitchy-nosed demon from the underworld sent to steal his very breath. The disaster happened near the galley. Ash had been approaching his bowl of premium cream when a shadow darted across the floor. A common house mouse, no larger than a thumb, paused by the bowl. Ash's fur stood on end until he resembled a static-charged puffball. In a frantic, blind retreat, he backed up so quickly he tripped over a coiled mooring rope and tumbled through an open porthole. The cold Atlantic took him instantly. Hours later, the tide deposited a sodden, shivering grey lump onto the sands of the Isle of Whispering Reeds. Ash coughed up brine, his green eyes wide with the trauma of the sea. He was alone, wet, and convinced that at any moment, a giant sea mouse would emerge from the surf to finish the job. Chapter 3, An Unlikely Meeting. Elara found him near the tide pools. She had been scavenging for shellfish when she saw the grey tuft. Her amber eyes flared bright with curiosity. As she approached, Ash scrambled backward, his claws digging into the sand. Then, he saw it. Elara's mouse tail flicked nervously behind her. Her ears, slightly rounded and covered in fine downy fur, twitched at the sound of the wind. Ash let out a pathetic, high-pitched yowl of pure terror. To him, he had died and gone to the great mouse trap in the sky. Here was the queen of mice, a giant in human form, coming to exact revenge for every feline transgression in history. But Elara didn't pounce. She didn't squeak or bite. She simply sat down on the flat rock, 5 feet away, and began to hum. It was a low, melodic sound that vibrated in the humid air. "I'm weird too," she said softly, her voice like cracking dry leaves. "But I don't bite, little cloud." Ash watched her glowing eyes. They didn't look predatory, they looked lonely. Over the next 3 days, the kitten's hunger overcame his phobia. Elara would leave scraps of dried fish on a leaf, slowly moving the safe zone closer to her feet. By the end of the week, Ash realized that while this girl had the parts of a mouse, she had the heart of a protector. Chapter 4, The Cure of Kindness. The transformation was subtle. Ash began to follow Elara through the island's interior. When a field mouse started through the reeds, Ash would start to bolt, but then he would look at Elara's tail, steady and calm, and he would stop. He realized that the features he feared were the very things that made his only friend beautiful. He began to sleep curled in the crook of her arm. The mouse girl was the source of his warmth, his food, and his safety. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ash did something he had never done. He chased a cricket. He didn't hide, he didn't tremble. Elara watched him, a stray tear carving a path through the dirt on her cheek. "You aren't afraid of the small things anymore," she whispered, stroking his soft grey head. Ash purred, a deep rhythmic thrum. In his simple feline mind, he didn't see a cursed girl or a half-mouse monster. He saw his person. He saw Elara. To Ash, she was the standard of perfection, and the mouse-like traits were simply the marks of her kindness. This absolute, unconditional acceptance began to vibrate through the air, a frequency that the ancient curse on Elara's bloodline could not withstand. Chapter 5, The Breaking of the Shell. The breaking didn't happen with a roar, but with a shimmer. As Ash licked Elara's hand in a gesture of pure, unadulterated love, a blinding golden light erupted from her chest. The curse had been fueled by her own shame and the rejection of her kin. It required the genuine acceptance of a natural enemy to shatter. As Ash looked at her with adoring eyes, the mouse tail dissolved into sparks. Her ears rounded into human form, and the ember glow in her eyes softened into a piercing, brilliant blue. She stood taller, her blonde hair flowing down her back like a river of gold. The island itself seemed to exhale. Days later, a royal scouting vessel spotted the golden light from the shore. When Elara stepped onto the mainland, she was no longer the timid scurry girl. She walked with the grace of a queen, Ash perched confidently on her shoulder. She returned to her family's estate, not to beg for entry, but to reclaim her birthright. When her parents saw her, radiant, powerful, and whole, they fell to their knees. But Elara didn't need their apologies. She took the keys to the library, the deeds to the northern lands they had kept from her, and her rightful place at the head of the table. She had been cast away for being weird, but she returned as something they could never be, someone who knew the value of a friend, no matter what shape they took. Chapter 6, The Uninvited Guests. The return of Elara was not the quiet, repentant homecoming her parents, Lord and Lady Vane, had envisioned. They had expected a bedraggled girl begging for a crust of bread. Instead, they got a whirlwind of golden hair and a very smug-looking grey kitten. Elara didn't just walk into the manor, she reclaimed it like a general taking a surrendered fort. "Oh, Elara, darling." Lady Vane squealed, her voice hitting a pitch that made Ash's ears flatten. "We always knew you would overcome that little skin condition." Elara didn't blink. Her blue eyes, once glowing embers, were now as cold as Arctic ice. "It wasn't a skin condition, Mother. It was a curse. And you didn't wait for me to overcome it, you sent me to an island to die of boredom or scurvy, whichever came first." The family had prepared a welcome-back luncheon, which was really just an excuse to see if she was still twitching. Her sisters, Seraphina and Arabella, sat at the long mahogany table, clutching their pearls and trying to hide their jealousy. Elara sat at the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for her father. "That's my chair, Elara," Lord Vane muttered, his moustache quivering. "Actually," Elara said, pulling a rolled parchment from her bodice, "the ancient deed to the estate she'd found in the island's hidden ruins, according to the ancestral law of abandonment of the heir, this house, the lands, and even that ugly vase in the hallway belong to me. You are currently my guests. And Ash's guests." Ash, sensing the tension, decided this was the perfect moment to sneeze directly into the lobster bisque. Chapter 7, The Great Mouse Hunt, or lack thereof. The Vane sisters were determined to prove that Elara was still mousy at heart. They decided the best way to humiliate her was to trigger her old instincts. Seraphina, who had the moral compass of a damn brag, decided to release a box of white mice during the evening tea. "Watch," Seraphina whispered to Arabella. "She'll start squeaking and diving under the table. She'll show her true colors." The box was opened. A dozen mice scurried across the polished marble floor. Lady Vane let out a rehearsed scream, waiting for Elara to join the panic. Elara simply took a sip of her Earl Grey. Ash, the deadly mouse slayer, in his own mind, looked down from Elara's lap. One mouse ran right over his paw. In the old days, Ash would have launched himself into the chandelier. But now? He just looked at the mouse, looked at Elara, and yawned so wide his pink tongue curled. "Ash," Elara said, nodding toward the rodents. "Are these friends of yours?" Ash reached down and gently, very gently, patted a mouse on the head with a retracted claw. The mouse, confused by the lack of being eaten, sat down and started cleaning its whiskers. "You see," Elara said, looking at her horrified sisters. Ash has learned that being small doesn't make you a monster. It's a pity you haven't learned that being tall doesn't make you a human. Chapter 8, The Inventory of Regret. By the third day, the regret began to set in for the Vanes, mostly because Elara started charging them rent. 200 gold pieces a week? Lord Vane wailed, looking at the bill Elara had presented him. For my own bedroom? It's a very nice bedroom, Elara countered, scratching Ash behind the ears. And since you spent my inheritance on silk waistcoats and bad investments while I was eating seaweed, I think it's only fair. Also, the attic is leaking. You should probably get on that, father. I hear manual labor is good for the soul. The family was forced to downsize. Seraphina and Arabella were moved to the servants' quarters to build character, which mostly involved them crying over the lack of Egyptian cotton sheets. The funniest part was the local gossip. The townspeople, who had once whispered about the cursed girl, now lined up at the gates to bring her gifts. They saw her beauty and her power, and they saw how she treated the great Lord Vane like an incompetent footman. The irony was a dish served cold, and Elara was enjoying every bite. Chapter 9, The Ball of Utter Humiliation. To solidify her social standing, Elara threw a ball. But it wasn't a normal ball. She invited every misfit in the kingdom, the squint-eyed cobblers, the hunchback scholars, and even the local rat-catcher, who brought his best dogs. You can't be serious. Lady Vane hissed, forced to wear a dress made of recycled curtains because Elara had locked the vault. The Duke is coming. You'll ruin us. I'm already ruined, remember? Elara smiled. I'm the weird one. The ball was a riot. Ash wore a tiny velvet bow tie and sat on a velvet cushion next to the punch bowl, acting as the unofficial bouncer. When the Duke arrived, he was charmed by Elara's wit and her ferocious grey guardian. Lord Vane tried to take credit for her upbringing. Yes, we always knew she had a spark. The island was a retreat, a spiritual journey we curated for her. Elara overheard this and leaned in. Is that right, father? Then surely you won't mind giving the Duke a tour of the island? I've left your old shack just as it was. It's quite cozy, if you don't mind the giant crabs. Lord Vane turned a shade of purple that matched the Duke's royal sash. He spent the rest of the night hiding behind a potted palm. Chapter 10, The Queen of the Misfits. The final blow to the Vane family's pride came when the King's Herald arrived. Because Elara had broken a great curse through the power of unconventional friendship, she was to be awarded the title of the Order of the Ember. As she stood on the dais in the town square, the sun catching the gold in her hair, the Vane family was forced to stand in the front row and clap until their hands were sore. They knew they had lost everything, not just their money, but their dignity. They had thrown away a diamond because they thought it was a pebble, and now that diamond was the most powerful person in the province. Elara looked down at them, then down at the great kitten in her arms. Ash let out a triumphant mew and tried to bat at the king's medal. I think, Elara whispered to Ash, we should go back to the island for a vacation. Just us. And the family? Ash's eyes seemed to ask. Elara looked at her parents, who were currently arguing over who had to wash the dishes that night. They can stay here. They've finally found something they're good at, being miserable. With a flick of her, now metaphorical, tail, Elara walked off the stage, leaving her old life and her family's regrets in the dust. She wasn't just a girl who was part mouse anymore, she was a woman who was all heart. Chapter 11, The Picnic of the Victorious. The return to the Isle of Whispering Reeds was a far cry from Elara's first arrival. Instead of a weeping girl dumped from a rowboat, she arrived on a sleek, white-sailed yacht purchased with the Vane family's mismanaged emergency fund. Ash stood at the prow, his grey fur slicked back by the sea breeze, looking like a feline conqueror scanning for the perfect nap spot rather than sea monsters. "Ready, Ash?" Elara asked, stepping into the landing boat. She wore an airy gown of pale gold that shimmered like the sand. No corsets, no heavy velvet, and certainly no mouse tail, though a phantom twitch still tickled her spine when she was excited. The beach was unchanged, yet everything looked different through the eyes of the free. The jagged rocks no longer resembled prison walls, they were sun-warmed lounges. The whispering reeds didn't mock, they sounded like soft applause. As Elara unpacked the picnic, she took a certain satisfaction in imagining her mother struggling with a mop and her sisters discovering that silk slippers were poorly suited for weeding. "For you, Sir Ash," she said, serving him smoked salmon and clotted cream on silver. Ash ate with the gusto of a cat who had moved from true hunger to true luxury. When a small field mouse poked its head from a dune, Ash didn't panic or hunt, he simply raised a paw in a lazy salute. In this no-predator zone, the mouse sat and nibbled a breadcrumb. "My parents thought the silence was a punishment," Elara mused, tossing a grape into the air. "They thought being alone with your own mind was a death sentence." She looked at her steady hands. The island had given her the tools to break her curse, silence to hear her worth and a friend who didn't judge. As the sun dipped, turning the sky a bruised purple that matched her old ember eyes, Elara felt a profound closure. She wasn't just back, she was finally found. "Come on, Ash," she called, heading back toward the yacht's library and fireplace. Behind her, the Vane family crest, a ring she'd tossed into the surf, sparkled briefly before being buried by the tide. The mainland was waiting, but she would no longer fit into it, she would reshape it.